I was about to thank Dean Golino for this introduction, but I see he has wisely departed. I think he may be back to see if there are any questions about some of the things that I may say. I am obliged to all of you for coming out, risking the parking shortages on the campus, and then finding that some of you finding that after you have parked your car that's only half the problem. But to all of you, I'm delighted that you are here. I feel it an honor to be invited to participate in the faculty lecture series, and I'm especially pleased to have a chance to speak on this particular topic. I've taken the liberty of adding a few words to the rather short title that was given to the lecture tonight. It's in the series, as you know, The Many Faces of Integration, and the topic tonight is advertised as running like this: the problem in America, the moral issue and implications versus the historical theory. And now I'd like to add a few words to that title, or the case for integration now. At a dinner here on campus only 8 nights ago, I was startled to hear a prominent and thoughtful Negro proclaim that the battle for integration had been won. In a way, he is right. The Supreme Court has spoken, and so has our state Supreme Court. The President has spoken. Congress has not yet passed a civil rights bill, but our state government has taken vigorous action. Since we have no mechanism for a nationwide referendum, it is difficult to document just where American public opinion stands. I note, however, that many white supremacists to whom integration is thoroughly distasteful recognize the integration trend. They see opposition to it as a rearguard action which in the long run is hopeless. They recognize that to the American people, integration is not just a passing whim, but the chosen destiny. Familiar though the term is, we should pin down the meaning of integration. What the integrationists ask is a good clue to its essence. They ask that every American, whatever his race or origin, shall have equal opportunity and equal treatment at the polls, at the hands of the law and the police, in seeking employment, in finding a place to live, in getting an education, and in access to public places, including privately owned and operated public places. The integration they are talking about is the proposition that no person in our land shall be tainted at birth as a second-class citizen. Stated thus, and I believe this is a fair statement, integration has acceptance. One proof is the refrain so often heard from someone about to take a contrary position. And I quote, "I agree with you in principle, but..." Well, where the battle still rages, and doubtless will for a good long time, is in the translation of this theory into practice. The basic principle was laid down 85 years ago. I'm making this speech 2 years too soon, as you notice, but the basic principle was laid down 85 years ago in the 14th Amendment. It was laid down clearly enough to afford very effective protection to corporations. Until recently, this part of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, has served as far less of a guarantee to our minorities, including the Negroes for whom it ostensibly was written. The issue today is that the elementary fairness of integration is not satisfactorily present if Negroes are prevented from registering to vote, if Mexican Americans are intimidated from entering the polling place, if most Negroes, Mexican Americans, and Orientals are thrust into ghettos, if most Negroes are shunted into Negro jobs, if these people come in for several times their share of police brutality, or if most Negro children have to go to Negro schools. Integration means eliminating such discriminations. It means making sure that minority citizens have the rights, privileges, opportunities, and treatment that are ordinary for whites. Integration is the one problem that President Kennedy has presented as a moral issue. He asks for a tax cut, but on grounds of economic theory and expediency. He urged approval of the Test Ban Treaty, but as a calculated risk. He wants federal aid to education. He wants federal aid to education badly enough that he is willing to forget his earlier belief that aid to church schools would be unconstitutional. But his prime reason appears to be that we must catch hold of all potential scientific talent. When it comes to integration, however, he puts it to us as a moral duty. Inasmuch as integration is no more than an application of the Golden Rule, this assertion is appropriate. I am not sure that our nation or any nation as such has a conscience. But alerted by Bull Connor and his police dogs and fire hoses, by the assassinations of Alvis and Evers, and the more recent Sunday school bombing, a great many Americans feel a sense of guilt that in this land of ours, discriminatory mistreatment and denials of opportunity are visited on so many persons who comprise our minorities, and on them simply because they were not born into the majority. There's a further reason for a stirring of our consciences. Again and again, we as a people and as a nation have made glowing pronouncements of our dedication to a principle identical with or synonymous with integration. A featured passage in the Declaration of Independence asserts, and I quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, in order to perform a more perfect union, and among other things, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." And then it goes on in reciting what we, the people, are about to do for these reasons. Summarizing in his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln spoke of ours as, and I quote, "a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." The 14th Amendment, to which I alluded earlier, reads in part, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens, nor deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the laws." The Pledge of Allegiance rises to its climax with the words, and I will insert a little emphasis where recently I have been hearing some emphasis in the reciting of the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance rises to its climax with the words, "One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." I had recited the pledge and heard it, I suppose, hundreds or thousands of times without, until recently, getting that inflection of emphasis on the last two words of the Pledge of Allegiance. Segregation and discriminations based on race do not comport with these key elements of our national credo. Now, American practice over the years has often fallen far short of what this eloquence promised. From the outset, the Indian was downgraded as a heathen, a savage, an encumbrance on the land. We have only recently outgrown the notion that a good Indian is a dead Indian. fine phrases on the brotherhood of man, equal protection, and so on, seem not to extend to these first Americans. In our day, there's somewhat more concern. It perhaps is illustrated in the federal government's recent offer of an out-of-court settlement to the Indians of California at the rate of 47 cents an acre for the 9/10 of California, of which the ancestors of these Indians were deprived back in the 1850s. My opinion, for what it may be worth, is that this represents a very low evaluation on what was then, in the 1850s, a gold-rich land. The immigrant minorities also have been looked down upon. For a reminder of the prevailing attitude, one need only think of some of the, and I quote, terms of endearment applied to various of these immigrant groups, such as wops, frogs, greasers, bohunks, krauts, kikes, dagos, chinks. If you'd like to extend that list, I refer you without hesitation to the Dictionary of American Slang. Well, America did spell opportunity. For almost all these immigrant people, there were some improved conditions once they arrived in America. I recall my father telling me that in his boyhood he saw immigrants come into Illinois, where he lived, and on muddy days, the immigrants would just walk down in the street instead of on the sidewalk. And they did not dare come up on the sidewalk until someone explained to them that in America the sidewalks were for everybody, not just for their betters. This is one slight example of the upgrading of condition that many immigrants found when they arrived in America. But meanwhile, many immigrants took a scrounging from landlords, storekeepers, employers, and others. California has the blot on its record of a prolonged and bitter pogrom against the Chinese and of harassment of the Japanese through school segregation, through a discriminatory land tax, much later ruled unconstitutional, and through pressure from Californians for mass arrest of the Japanese, including the Japanese Americans, in 1942. Exploitation of other labor groups of various sorts has been commonplace in California, of the Mexicans, of the Filipinos, of the Okies and the Arkies. Our state history is marred by such episodes as the Clear Lake Massacre, a massacre of Indians, the Los Angeles Massacre, a massacre of Chinese, the Zoot Suit Riot, victimizing Mexicans, the Sleepy Lagoon prosecution, again victimizing Mexicans, and the black Muslim police shooting. And I suppose we have our choice of which of these two minorities, the black Muslims or the police, we think of as victimized in this particular affair. In referring to the police as a minority, I'm merely echoing Chief Parker, who has frequently called attention to this fact about the police force of Los Angeles. Nationwide, the most glaring discrepancy between theory and practice in this matter of equal treatment, equal opportunity, is the matter of Negro slavery. The United States was not the only country to base part of its development on slavery. Sparta had its helots, Athens and Rome had their slaves, medieval Europe, its serfs, the Inca Empire, its commoners subject to the demands of the ruling class. But the United States South persisted with slavery long after the rest of the civilized world, except Brazil, had given it up. In the United States, the scale of slavery was grandiose, and the slavery practiced had an extraordinary harshness. The power of a master over his slave was almost unlimited. And this apparently is not true to the form of slavery the world over. In many instances, slavery in other places was a much more moderate institution. Slavery once touched almost every colony, though principally the southern mainland and West Indian colonies. By the time of the American Revolution, it was pretty well gone, actually and officially, north of the Mason and Dixon line. The Northwest Ordinance in 1787 forbade slavery north of the Ohio, and subsequent actions barred it in territories north of 36 degrees and 30 minutes. The expansion of slavery can be charted from 6 of the original states into 9 more states admitted to the Union by 1845. Expansion of slavery nominally into New Mexico and Utah by the Compromise of 1850, and expansion theoretically into any other state to come after the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857. All along there have been some objections to slavery. A few individuals freed their slaves, and the Founding Fathers in 1787 wrote into the Constitution a license for subsequent abolishment of the slave trade. In 1831 there was debate in the Virginia legislature on the alternatives of continuing slavery or of emancipation linked with deportation of the freed Negroes. For the most part, however, there was not much discussion and no great clamor for abolition until William Lloyd Garrison raised his voice, also in 1831. Most active and articulate abolitionists were men and women from the northern free states. Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Theodore Weld, Arthur Tappan, Henry C. Wright, Harriet Beecher Stowe. James G. Birney of Kentucky stands out as one former slave owner among the leading abolitionists. He had to transfer most of his work farther north. The Grimke sisters brought a southern accent to the abolitionist cause, but had moved to Philadelphia before making open attack on slavery. In the non-slaveholding North, these advocates of abolition met a stormy reception. Garrison was mobbed in Boston. Birney manhandled in Cincinnati. Weld attacked in rural Ohio. Prudence Crandall forced to close her school for Negroes in Boston. And Amos Lovejoy martyred in Alton, Illinois. The Northwest states from Ohio and Illinois to Michigan and Iowa let it be known in no uncertain terms that they did not like Lincoln's notions about emancipation. They had no wish to be overrun by free Negroes surging up from the South. It may not be fair to the great emancipator to quote his reassurances to these constituents of his in the Northwest, but this, in brief, is what he had to say to them, and it's quoted from his message to Congress in December of 1862. But why, he asked, should Emancipation South send the free people north? People of any color seldom run unless there be something to run from. Heretofore, colored people, to some extent, have fled north from bondage, and now perhaps from bondage and destitution. But if gradual emancipation and deportation, that of course means shipping the free Negroes out of the country, if gradual emancipation and deportation be adopted, they will have neither of these things to flee from. Their old masters will give them wages till new homes can be found for them in congenial climes and with people of their own blood and race. And in any event, cannot the North decide for itself whether to receive them? Well, now, this doesn't sound at all integrationist, does it? These comments of Lincoln, in answer to some complaints that have been coming in about discontent in the Old Northwest, the region north of the Ohio, about the prospect of freed Negroes moving up into that territory. Throughout the South, most whites were not slave owners, and only a comparative few owned gangs of slaves. Yet there was a great degree of sectional unity opposing abolition. So far as the economy of the South was concerned, this attitude was sound. Difference of opinion long reigned whether slavery was profitable, but the latest expert advice is that, especially where slave increase is taken into account, slavery was profitable. Sociology and social psychology affirm that slavery also gave the poor whites, however impoverished, the slaves as a group over whom they could feel superior. The South was not yet solid in party affiliation, but on the slavery question it was much more united than was the North. After the 1830s, or after 1830 or thereabouts, the South, through its intellectuals, writers, editors, political leaders, and other spokesmen, developed a creed or doctrine in praise of slavery. Thomas R. Dew, William Gilmore Simms, John C. Calhoun, George Fitzhugh, these and some others, essayed a justification of the peculiar institution of the South. In these writings, one finds it maintained, one thing, that slaves were better fed and housed, better cared for than many a laborer in the North. Second, that slaves were not subject to being laid off, but could count on cradle-to-the-grave care. Third, that slaves were more carefree and happy, all responsibility being assumed by the master. Fourth, that Negroes were incapable of managing their affairs, that they were perpetual children, incompetent to be anything other than wards. Someone had to assume the caretaker role. Someone had to pick up, in Kipling's phrase, I suppose, the white man's burden. Fifth, that Negroes as a race were inferior, or from another perspective, here was the doctrine of white supremacy. According to Professor Thomas R. Dew of Virginia, writing in 1831, a merrier being does not exist on the face of the globe than the Negro slave of the United States. Governor Hammond of South Carolina amplified this theme. He wrote, "The relations of the most beloved and honored chief are frigid and unfelt compared with those existing between the master and his slaves, who served his father and rocked his cradle, or have been born into his household and look forward to serve his children, who have been through life the props of his fortune and the objects of his care, who have partaken of his griefs and look to him for comfort in their own, whose sickness he has so frequently watched over and relieved, whose holidays he has so often made joyous by his bounties and his presence, for whose welfare, when absent, his anxious solicitude never ceases, and whose hearty and affectionate greetings never fail to welcome him home. In this cold, calculating, ambitious world of ours, there are few ties more heartfelt or of more benignant influence than those which mutually bind the master and the slave under our ancient system handed down from the Father of Israel." The end of this quotation. But its spirit is matched in another, written by Mary H. Eastman, supplying the rationale for this attitude about the beauty of the master-slave relationship. Slavery, authorized by God, permitted by Jesus Christ, sanctioned by the apostles, maintained by good men of all ages, is still existing in a portion of our beloved country. And this quotation, I'm sure you would like to know, is from a book entitled, not Uncle Tom's Cabin, but Aunt Phyllis's Cabin. Or, as another good Southerner phrased it, as a man, a Christian, and a citizen. Well, this is an editor. I must get that in, otherwise you'll think there's something wrong with the syntax of the sentence. This good Southern editor had this to say: as a man, a Christian, and a citizen, we believe that slavery is right, that the condition of the slave as it now exists in slaveholding states is the best existing organization of civil society. Despite this rosy picture, which the slavery apologists did much to publicize, it is not recorded that any free American ever asked to be made a slave. Certain analogies stand out between the struggle over slavery and the more recent one over segregation. In the abolition movement, Northerners predominated, though joined by a few Southern, and I quote, traitors to their section. Northern whites also opened up the current debate on integration. A few Southern whites joined in, and I have noticed that whenever a Southern voice or accent voices the sentiments of integration, it seems to carry more impact than when it's spoken in ordinary language. Slaves could not take much of a hand in the drive against slavery. Negroes now are very prominent in the integration movement. Among them, a long roster could be given. This is a rather arbitrarily select one: Martin Luther King, the Reverend Mr. Abernathy, the Reverend Mr. Shuttlesworth, Messrs. Wilkins and Randolph and Farmer, and locally, such persons as Robert Singleton and Christopher Taylor and Marnesbit Tackett. I trust that these local names register with as many of you as do the national names I've chosen. The abolitionists came from all walks of life, including many working men, many Quakers, many others with strong religious convictions. Today's integrationists may seem to count more students than professors. Many from rank and file, some churchmen, many liberals along with some conservatives, many civil liberties advocates, and not so many from the Taxpayers Protective Associations. I have heard it alleged that hilltop liberals are less stirred than those who are closer neighbors to the minorities. But I'm not absolutely certain that this last observation is correct. Before the Civil War, Southern apostles of slavery charged that the abolitionists were trying to stir up slave insurrections. None occurred of any consequence after Nat Turner's in Virginia in 1831. In other words, at about the time the slave insurrections in the South stopped, the abolitionists began to speak vigorously in favor of abolition. Nonviolence is the keynote of the Negro protest today, and yet segregationists assert that this nonviolence is a sham and it may lead to a grand explosion. The abolitionists indulged in overstatement and wild charges set forth most emotionally. Today, the more extreme complaints about the existing order come more from those who do not really want integration, persons such as the black Muslims and James Baldwin. The plea for integration is an appeal to conscience, but many other sober arguments are mustered for it. For instance, although school integration is requested for the child trapped in the middle of a ghetto, it is also much needed for the child cloistered in an all-white neighborhood and all-white schools. Without it, neither of these youngsters is going to be well prepared for today's and tomorrow's world. Another instance, sober argument for integration, is in an article by Loren Miller, in which he calculates the stimulation that would come to the American economy if the American Negro nation, and he puts nation in quotes, the American Negro nation of 17 million persons living here right in the midst of America, if this nation could be brought up to in quotes, the American average in economic productivity and in purchasing power. Now, perhaps the more striking parts of the analogy between slavery, segregation, or the anti-slavery drive and the anti-segregation drive are in the pro-slavery and pro-segregation arguments. The friends of slavery claimed that the slaves did not want to be free, or they would have all run away. The advocates of segregation assert that today's Negroes do not want to integrate, or they would all have broken out of the ghetto. The slave owners, it was said, knew the Negroes and were best able to look out for their interests. Today's Southerners, we are told, know their Negroes and are best able to take care of them. The slaves, so the argument ran, got better treatment on the plantations than they would have had in free employment. Today's Negroes, according to a very famous Santa Barbaran, are better off in Negro schools where the program can be patterned to their needs. The slavery and segregation exponents agree with each other that the Negroes are an inferior race. They also say, respectively, that God intended the Negroes to be slaves, and that if God had intended that there should be integration, he would not have made the Negroes black. Because history is not exactly repetitive, analogies offered are seldom entirely true. Historical analogy, such as I have been offering you in the last few paragraphs, is one of the weaker forms of proof. There is, however, so much continuity between slavery and segregation, and between the drives to do away with slavery and with segregation, that we have here a higher order of likeness than mere analogy. And let me go a little farther in possible analogies. Lincoln asked, as you all remember, can our nation exist half free and half slave? No one, to my knowledge, has posed the sequel to that question. Can our nation exist half free of segregation and half enslaved by segregation? Or, to rephrase that same question but in entirely different words, to abolish segregation, the carryover of slavery, must we have a second war between the states? Civil War I was a crude, painful, costly, and inefficient way to abolish slavery. 19th century America could come up with no better way of accomplishing, however, the doing away with slavery. 20th century America, simply because it has this object lesson before it, ought to find a better way to achieve integration. And I see at least one ground for optimism, still in terms of analogy. Up to 1861, the United States was making no appreciable headway toward reducing or ending slavery. And yet in the past few years, we have moved a considerable distance into integration. Our Supreme Court's landmark decision of 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, is in sharp contrast to the Taney Court's Dred Scott decision of 1857. Today's integration movement has already opened many doors to voting places, lunch counters, hotels, buses, trains, and planes, to employment, and to some extent to housing and schooling. The practice of integration is on the increase. Nevertheless, to a surprising number of Americans, integration is a prospect to be approached with great caution, hesitantly, or even with alarm. Even the word must be dodged. Only one member of the Los Angeles City School Board, Mrs. Mary Tingloff, seems to be at peace with the word integration. When a committee of that board recently completed an 18-month study having to do with equal educational opportunity, not a one of the 27 recommendations brought into the board contained the word integration. Mostly it was for upgrading the pattern of schooling in the more deprived areas. That meant improving the education of Negroes in the Negro schools, of Mexican Americans in the Mexican American schools. Let's take another example. When a committee, when the California State Department of Education called in advisors on this same problem of school segregation existing in California, the State Board of Education, or rather the State Department of Education, did so under the label of ethnic imbalance in the schools. When the usually bold American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California set up a study and action committee some months ago, it chose the relatively neutral phrase civil rights. The most expressive assignment for any such committee is integration now, and taking into account that the task of achievement is certain to be long drawn out. The most realistic name for any such group, and I give it freely to any of you who might wish to incorporate such a group, would, I think, be this: a permanent committee for integration now. After we have heard the other lectures in this series, our thoughts on integration will have been enlarged, refined, and perhaps corrected. My present thinking is that the case for integration now is compelling. Integration is needed if the United States is to be able to hold up its head in diplomacy with free nations of color. It is needed because of our more advanced knowledge today of the meaning of race, and especially of the limitations of the meaning of race. It is needed because we can no longer do without the contribution that our minorities could make to purchasing power, to capacity to produce, and in intelligence, skill, and genius. It is needed because we cannot afford the luxury of duplicating for the Negro minority drinking fountains, bus runs, parks, playgrounds, theaters, churches, schools. It is demanded because the separate but equal fallacy of pre-1954 jurisprudence has been exploded, and because with less fanfare and less publicity, the Supreme Court has also exploded the notion of all deliberate speed. It is demanded because 100 years have passed since emancipation, and demanded also because 1863 was disgracefully late for the freeing of American slaves. It is needed because integration should have been begun long before emancipation. The proper time would have been 1607 as concerned the Indians, and 1619 before the Mayflower as concerned the Negroes. As a matter of fact, there probably was a better degree of integration of the physical sort in the period of slavery than there was in the post-Civil War era. Jim Crow came in a big way late in the 19th century. Integration is needed because we profess to be a democracy, a society in which every person is equal before the law. Finally, integration is demanded because those Americans who are white, even those who are WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, integration is demanded because even WASPs can no longer pretend that they are a superior race, nor can they any longer ask any of the American minorities to pretend that they, the minorities, are inferior. The only prop that ever offered any theoretical justification for slavery or segregation was the notion of a master race, the notion of white supremacy. And long since that prop has been yanked out from under the segregationists. The only honorable recourse is integration now.
Thank you, Professor Caughy. As Professor Caughy indicated, he is willing to answer some questions. Before we start on the questions, may I please point out this is a very large audience. It will be impossible to answer every question. We will try to answer as many as possible. Please do not make speeches, but ask questions. Make your questions brief and to the point. Are there any questions?
I'm not sure I heard.
Do you think that the same thing that has happened to the Negro will happen to the Mexican American?
Well, many of the disadvantages of segregation have already been felt by the Mexican Americans in our community. In some respects, the Mexican Americans have an advantage over the Negro. It's easier, I'm sure, for Mexican Americans to pass over and to integrate individually than it is for Negroes to do so. On the other hand, the Mexican Americans, many of them have a language handicap that makes it somewhat more difficult for them to accommodate and to fit in our society. Or do you really want to know whether I think that the Mexican Americans are going to rise in a protest activity comparable to the present protest activity? But on which of these points? The second one. Oh, I don't know. I'm a poor prophet. I'm just a historian, you see. After something like this does happen, I will try to figure out why it happened. But I can't seem to work this magic machine in the other direction so that I can give you the odds on just how things will come out. Though it's a good sign, I suppose, that the most integrated team in big league baseball took the measure of the one that was slowest to integrate. Yes? Mm-hmm.
You keep proposing integration now, and I was wondering how you propose to convince people who are in favor of integration never, integration now.
Well, I think we're already, there are forces at work already that should provide some of that convincing in the course of the next 2 or 3 generations. Much integration has taken place. Baseball, for example, many other public activities. Negroes don't have appreciable trouble getting to vote in California, I think, nowadays. And yet here are the SNCC people working as hard as they can just on this one point down south to try to bring that about in Georgia and Mississippi. And feeling that if the Negroes get the vote down there, then they'll be well on the way to achieving the other elements of integration. I think putting integration step by step into operation and moving into that as rapidly as possible is the best way of eliminating the integration never segment in our community, or rather persuading them to join in with those who will tolerate integration, and persuading some of those people to join in with those who would like to push rapidly for integration. Yes, sir?
How much integration do you believe the President's civil rights will accomplish?
Well, nobody knows. It hasn't been adopted yet. If it's adopted in its present wording, it would accomplish little more than in the wording in which it was sent over from the White House to the Congress. It's been amended to make it a little stronger. But I haven't read the bill, but I was told that in its initial wording it would not have added a single thing toward integration or to civil rights in California. That by state law, the entirety of the civil rights measure before Congress had already been enacted. But it then would have nationwide application and would have the support of the federal government backup. It's a short step. Almost everything that the integration now people ask is in the nature of token integration. Nobody, I think, believes that all Americans should be tossed up in the air and mixed up thoroughly and brought down in absolutely even array of color spectrum spread out all over. Yes, sir?
You, in your presentation, mentioned that there was no way of getting a referendum of the American people. Would you care to comment on the referendums that there were in Berkeley and in Cambridge?
Well, way we figure out whether there's a mandate to the president to do something, or the governor to do something, or the mayor to do something, or the city council to do something, is to read the election returns. And we don't have a clear-cut question, a simple yes or no question up. It's a matter of who gets elected, or shall a particular bill be passed or not passed. But usually in our nationwide voting, we don't even get it down to a particular bill, like the measure in Berkeley that was defeated. I don't know the real answer on the Berkeley question, but I'm quite sure there were some other elements involved in it than the simple question of how fast to go on integration. Yes, sir?
You made a mention of the Mexican-American having a difficulty possibly in learning the language.
Yes.
Toward their integration. What problem is there for the Negro in the sense that there is such a problem?
Well, the Negroes have no language but American English. They were brought to this country in such a fashion so that it was very difficult for them to bring their native languages. They slave buyers loading a ship off Africa took great care to get a mixed cargo, a mixed passenger list. They were very reluctant to get Negroes together who came from the same town or village and who spoke the same language. So they had a very mixed group, as shipload by shipload, as they came over. And the process of scattering them out and forcing them to, well, making it very difficult for them to maintain their native languages, wiped out, I think, all recollection of such languages on the part of, well, practically wiped it out on the part of the American Negro. And if they have a language shortage, it's just that they haven't had a chance to learn enough of American English to serve their purposes well. What?
Do they have any other handicaps that would prevent them from becoming integrated? Such as education?
Well, sure. Their education on the whole has been inadequate, has been below par. Their job opportunity has been below par. Their housing circumstances have been below par. They have been less advantageously situated in many, many respects as compared to the average white in America. And this can't be corrected overnight. They can't all be, by a waving of a wand, given an absolutely even start with other Americans. Yes, sir?
Given the fact that the moral issue has been with us a long, long time, the only reason that the issue is being pressed today is because the Negro minority is determined whether to get there peacefully or get to the other way.
Well, this is...
Right isn't fountain under the Constitution.
I think the Negro demand for a very strong request, demand, I guess is a proper word for it, has a good deal to do with the degree of attention that the white community at large is giving to the question of integration today. There are some other factors, though, that enter into it. We have become a more sophisticated people than we were a few years ago. The oncoming generation has more social awareness than the outgoing generation was able to build up. In international affairs, it's a more practical moment to us to get this part of our house in order, of our housekeeping in order, than it was, say, 100 years ago, or 75 years ago. A number of things of this sort that help to account for the greater concern today with integration. But I would give a good deal of the credit to it, to the active demand by Negro groups.
Can I just follow up one other?
Sure.
Is that also doing one thing? I think our youth, most of our people have been stagnant the last 15 or 20 years, and this Negro rise is bringing up an attempt to preserve democracy in all ways, not only with the Negroes, but with everything else around America, what it stands for.
Well, I sincerely hope that that is true. Did you all hear this? Well, shall I try to repeat it? All right. This gentleman is saying that not only do the Negroes deserve a good deal of credit for precipitating the integration now issue in America, but that by doing so they have helped to stir much more widespread awareness of the problem of democracy and the degree to which we have not really lived up to some of the principles that we have professed. These aren't your words, but I hope these are your ideas. Yes?
To what extent can you relate the problem to the economic structure of the system? More specifically speaking, the essential capitalist structure of the society. Can you see a correlation, and what is it?
Well, there are interpretations of the whole slavery, the whole fact of slavery as an institution in the United States as the sort of slavery that would only exist where capitalism was strongly involved, and that the money-making aspect of slavery had much to do with the severity of it, slave mongering, selling slaves, breaking up what should have been slave family groups is one aspect of this. And certainly the continuity of slavery in the South was to quite an extent because it was a profitable enterprise to have slaves. And replacing slavery came another element of keeping a subordinate labor force available. The segregation or the discrimination against Negroes, the denying of certain privileges to them, certain opportunities to them, often helped to keep a sort of a captive, low-priced labor force available. And according to critics of capitalism, this is the sort of thing that may happen where there is great emphasis on the capitalist system. Yes, sir? You, sir.
Sir, is it true that the proper education of the Negro is impossible without integration? And this is also true in the vice versa fact that integration is impossible without education?
Well, I don't know whether you can put it quite as strongly as that or not. I think it can be maintained that integration is one of the best practical means of giving to students of all races an experience that will fit them to live in a world in which there are going to be people of more than one race. And that, in addition, there are some stimulations that flow back and forth from the presence of persons of varied backgrounds. This is a form of enrichment of education. As I would say, it's a form of enrichment of education if we can have some exchange students from foreign lands. I've been sent a clipping from Santa Barbara that education in Santa Barbara is being enriched this year, high school there, by the presence of three, I guess it's a one-way exchange here, 3 students from Birmingham. And I'm quite sure that this is going to result, in some respects, in some better education coming along. A couple rows back.
I'd like to know through the whole speech, probably the crux of your argument was this comparison between the slavery system before the Civil War and the integration we have now. And I think you insinuated that unless something was done, we might have this sort of a civil conflict today. Now, exactly was this misinterpretation? And if so, well, if not, what kind of a conflict would you have envisioned?
This was set up as sort of a test to see whether you were following my line of argument about analogy. And as I guess I didn't make clear in my prepared remarks that I am a historian. You should only take me seriously when I am looking back. You should not take me seriously when I am looking forward. And this second Civil War has not broken out yet. I hope it will not, and I trust that there were other lessons that we learned in the first Civil War, or that we have learned from the first Civil War, that would make it much less likely that we would go to war of that sort again for any cause or any set of causes. And of course, get rid of slavery was not the only motive in the first Civil War, the Civil War. In fact, you can read some accounts of the origin of the first Civil War, and that hardly comes in at all. It was a war to preserve the Union, a war to test state rights, some other things, but it was the agency through which slavery finally was gotten rid of. Slavery went out because of the exercise of the war powers, and this is one of the major accomplishments of that war, one of the few excuses for that war. No, I sincerely hope that another Civil War will not be on us, but the advocates of one side or the other in the integration question could bring things up toward the point of war if the demands or the resistance are made too extreme, and if the argument about it is put entirely in terms of emotion, of heat, of anger. If we try to solve this problem in that fashion, we could find that we have brought ourselves into outright fighting about it. This, I think, is a possibility. Well, you are the boss here.
No, that's right. It's up to you. As long as I think
Let's hear from way back over there.
Would you say what integration now means to you in terms of the city schools in Los Angeles?
Yes, it would mean that the city schools of Los Angeles, which up to now, I guess, or up to a very short time ago, have been operating on a colorblind policy and have claimed officially not to know what the percentage of Negroes was at any school in the system, what the number of Negroes employed as teachers was, or their location in any school in the system. They've been operating a good school system, it seems to me, but within the attendance delivered by neighborhood school districts, and that means the attendance delivered by the housing patterns of this large community in which we live. And out of that came some schools that are almost entirely Negro in population, some others that are almost entirely Mexican American, some that are lily white, and some that have an admixture, probably not in the ratio that would be most advisable even in those schools which technically are integrated because they have some of one race, some of another. Now, what would I like to see the school system do? I would like to see the school system, first of all, take stock and find out just where it is in this matter of getting away from actual segregation, deriving from the residence patterns, and into a system where integration is a consciously sought out element in the school system. Not the only thing for which the schools are run, but one positive factor taken into account. And I would not expect that immediately there would be Negro students in every school in the system. I would not expect immediately that Negroes would be about, well, whatever fraction you want to say, of the teaching staff in every school. I would think, though, that some outright steps in these directions would take place or should take place, and that action along this line should begin right away, not waiting years and years and years before moving into it. I would expect that the start would be made with things that wouldn't cost a great deal of money, and that some of the integration should be achieved as a sort of a byproduct, along with allowing students to transfer to schools which have a specialty that's to their liking, or arranging visits of students from one school to another, not moving them just because their skins are this color or that, but because there's something going on at the school they're going to visit. It would be good for them to know about and to take back to their other school. And this answer is getting too long, but I would like, as an advocate of integration now, I would like to have steps taken immediately that would start toward the ultimate goal of what would be recognized by everybody as an integrated school system throughout the entire area. I'll let you decide how many more questions you want to hear.
I can stay here all night, but I think we are abusing your...
Well, there's a...
Well, why don't we
back
agree on
here,
one
maybe
more
I should
question,
hear
and
from
then that'll be the end for tonight.
You, sir.
Sir, would you comment further on your statement that James Baldwin was not the integration?
Well, maybe I read him wrong, but question was, would I comment further on my statement that James Baldwin is not for integration? Perhaps I read him wrong. I know he's very emphatic that he doesn't want it obscured that he's a Negro, and he doesn't want to make himself over into something that will be mistaken for a white person. But I thought that he preferred that all Negroes maintain their integrity to a very great extent, and this can be done, I'm sure, within the process of integration, even though in the process of Americanizing the immigrant, which was the slogan of our country for a long time and something that we worked hard at, and we were very impatient with immigrants who did not want to be Americanized, that is to say integrated. Well, in a way it is to say integrated. Perhaps I do him a disservice in saying that he is not for integration. He's for some other things too. And it may be some of these other things that he is for that make me think of him as something of an extremist rather than a person who would agree with all of my other ideas. But maybe he does agree with my idea about integration. Do you want to have a vote on that? Is James Baldwin for integration? How many think so?